it's always a little bit weird getting up to give a talk and not like immediately starting in prayer, but because we just started in prayer, that's why we pray Vespers first. But anyway, so the thought of the day, and I've been walking around apropos of absolutely nothing, telling all my staff this. The thought of the day, well, wait a minute, because we have about 8 minutes before we're expected to start, and there might be people who missed the opening sort of idea here. But the impetus behind these talks is that my previous parish was called St. Francis of Assisi, and I wanted to do kind of a deeper dive on who he is, because even though he is one of the most beloved saints in history and one of the most respected figures in the history of Western civilization, nobody really gets, I think, the full picture of St. Francis. And there's a lot of snippets and there's a lot of embellishments and things, but even as I was working on this afternoon, some of the things I was looking at in terms of the biographical information about him didn't even sound all that familiar to me, because the things that we tend to have, that the volume tends to be turned up on with regards to St. Francis, kind of cloud out some of the more important aspects of his life, and that's kind of what we're going into. But like I said, I've got a few minutes before we start this, and then afterward I have to give a talk to the RCIA class tonight. I was handed the topic, who is Jesus? And was not told kind of where that fit into the scheme of the rest of because there's usually with RCIA, there's sort of a progression through the creed and the different areas of theology and things like that. And this was more that we had to build in an extra class. So I have to, at 7:15, go upstairs and fill time. But I'm good at filling time. If there's anything I can do, it's obliviating.
How many candidates do you have this week?
I want to say about 20 or 25. We have a pretty good crowd.
Yeah.
And they're different situations. We've got some teenagers who just didn't receive all their sacraments, and so it made more sense to fold them into kind of the adult class. We've got some converts. We've got there's pretty big, fairly diverse group of people in terms of kind of why they're there. So I'm looking forward to it. And my talk tonight will start with mention of great figures like G.K. Chesterton and St. Athanasius and Romano Guardini and Benedict XVI, and then it will go on to Quentin Tarantino and drinking rye whiskey, but that's a whole I'll tell that story in this context at some point. But yeah, as soon as I was handed that assignment, the words started to form in terms of what I was, the story that I was going to tell started to. That's how it is for me most of the time. Like when I prepare my homilies, I don't really prepare a whole lot. I just, about Thursday, I look at the readings, and then something kind of gets my attention, and then I'm like, oh, here's the thing I can connect that to, and then kind of unpack it. And in 9 years of preaching, so I've been a priest for 8 years and was a deacon before that, for a year. So in 9 years of preaching, I've had 2 complaints about the length of my homily. I had one about 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, that I preached too short. Because in the parish I was in, people had grown accustomed to me talking for a while and liked that. They were kind of showing up getting their money's worth. And one Sunday I had gotten some bad news. Some friends of mine had a very, very awful family tragedy, and I was kind of close with them, and it kind of affected me too. So that weekend I just needed to be on autopilot. So I printed out an old homily that was about 500 words long and stood up there and read it and sat down, and somebody thought that somebody had gotten to me and complained about how long my homilies were because I was speaking from a prepared text. I pointed out to him that if he listened to my homilies, he would have heard the part at the beginning where I said that I didn't really have the brain capacity to preach this weekend because of the news I'd gotten. But apparently now there are people here who think my homilies are too long, and they're writing letters to the bishop about it. The problem with that being that I've been to 5 masses with Bishop Martin, who famously once said, "I cede my time to no one." And the only one of those 5 masses where he didn't preach 20 minutes was Monsignor Marcaccio's funeral, where he didn't preach at all. So, so I find that intensely ironic. We'll see how that goes. But I've always said that my memoir about being a parish priest is going to be called "What Did You Think Was Going to Happen When You Walked in Here Today?" Because that's the statement that I rarely actually say that in the situations in which I'm thinking it sometimes. But occasionally I actually said that one time. There was a couple who came in who wanted a green card marriage. He was American and she was, I think, Venezuelan, and they met on a dating app, and then her visa was about to expire, but they were totally into getting married in the church, and that was why they were in there. And I argued with them for about half an hour, and I finally just said, "What did you think was going to happen when you walked in here today?" But thankfully, when they moved in together the day before they came to meet with me, which was red flag number 4 of the conversation I had with them, actually. That was the fourth most egregious thing they talked about. They had moved to another diocese, so they weren't even our problem, but that was a very odd. I keep the notes from that meeting, so if I'm having a bad day, I can pull it out and just remember the absurdity. It wouldn't be hard if you were a parish priest to have a second career kind of moonlighting as a stand-up comic, because you wouldn't even have to be all that creative. You just talk about the weird things that happen at work. But anyway, we'll go ahead and dive into it. So the thought of the day today is that we walk around the parish and the school. I told my staff, I ran to my staff and said, "Do you want a fun fact?" And they're like, "Yeah, they want a fun fact." Because I have all kinds of fun facts because I don't know anything useful. I was actually told in the 8th grade that I was full of useless information, which is why I should join the academic competition team, and we filled a trophy case as a result of my extensive knowledge of things that don't matter that much. And so the fun fact of the day was the show MASH is a favorite of my family for decades now. I think my mother. There are 2 TV shows that within the first 45 seconds of an episode, she can identify which episode it is. And one of them is MASH, and the other one is Gilligan's Island. With Gilligan's Island, it's much easier because in spite of the fact that Gilligan's Island feels like it was on TV forever, it was only 3 seasons. And the first one was in black and white. So it feels like only a few episodes were in black and white, but really a third of the series was in black and white. But MASH is the other one. And MASH is much beloved by my family for many years. So Corporal Klinger, of course, part of his character, he's the company clerk, and he's trying to get out of the army. He really doesn't want to be there. He was drafted, doesn't want to be there. So what does he do? He wears dresses so that they'll think he's crazy, so that they'll kick him out of the army. And then, of course, the ironic twist is that he spends the whole war trying to leave Korea, and then at the end he falls in love with a Korean girl, and then ends up, after the war is over, marrying her and living in Korea. But Corporal Klinger, though, is again the company clerk wearing dresses to try to get kicked out on a psychological discharge. And 20th Century Fox, the production company that made MASH and held the rights to it, was recently bought, like in the last few years, was bought by Disney. So that means that Corporal Klinger is a Disney princess. And that all day, as I've told people, that was apropos of nothing, but it is apropos of what we're talking about now, because St. Francis of Assisi is not a Disney princess. And so as I was kind of saying as we were warming up here, the impetus behind these talks, and the series is called The Real St. Francis of Assisi. And the impetus behind this is that St. Francis is one of the most beloved saints in the history of the church. And not just in the Catholic Church, but Francis has a wide appeal outside of the Catholic Church. If you go to your local monument company to buy a concrete something or other for your garden, you can get all kinds of different things. You can get your girl jumping rope, and you can get a cat and a dog and a cow and all kinds of other things. You can also get a bird bath of St. Francis of Assisi. Even if you are in the most aggressively Baptist town, in the most aggressively Baptist county in the mountains of North Carolina, there you have about a half a dozen statues of St. Francis of Assisi. That it's actually to the point that if I walk up to someone's house and there's a statue of Mary out front, there's a 97% chance that the people living inside are Catholic. If there's a statue of St. Francis out front, that chance drops a little bit, because it's not necessarily the case that the appeal to him is from a Catholic, because he is so beloved. And so because he's so beloved, I think we have to understand who he is. Because all the things that I think a lot of people get attached to him for have nothing to do with why he's a saint. And they're unfortunately the things that the volume is turned up on the loudest in terms of who he is. If we take kind of the symphony of his life, the instruments that actually play the least amount of music are the ones that we're listening to, for the most part. So I wanted to clear the record as to who St. Francis is. And the way I explained this in my previous parish is St. Francis of Assisi in Jefferson, about a half hour from Boone. And the church there, when they built the new church 10 years ago, they put a window group in one transept that was the life of St. Francis. And so there's one big central window and then two smaller windows. The most familiar image on there to most people is going to be the smaller window to the left of Francis talking to deer and birds. There's birds around him. There's a deer kind of standing there with him, and I think there's even standing next to a creek, and there's a fish. He's talking to the animals. And that's the thing most people think of when they think of Francis of Assisi. Hence, you can buy a bird bath of him at the concrete place. The statue of him in the church there, he's got birds on him. I think, yeah, here, this statue that we have in here today, that I brought in for the purpose of this talk, and I'm going to move it out to the sanctuary, because tomorrow is actually his feast day. And at his feast day, the secular Franciscan fraternity here and Sister Kathy, who works here, who is herself a Franciscan, they're going to renew their promises at Mass tomorrow morning. And so we're going to put the statue out there in his honor. I'm always a fan of displaying the images of saints on their feast days. This year, unfortunately, one of my favorites is coming up, and I have a brand new image of them. The North American martyrs, their feast falls on a Saturday, and we don't have a Saturday morning Mass. So if I happen to have a quinceañera that day, I'm going to wear red and do the North American martyrs, because I like doing feast day quinceañeras. I've had two this year already that were obligatory, because you can't do a votive Mass if a feast ranks a certain way. So I had one on the Feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross, which made for a great homily, and I had one on the Feast of St. Lawrence on the 10th of August, which made for an even better homily. It's also a lot of fun when the book of Ecclesiastes comes up in the readings at a quinceañera, but that's neither here nor there. But the North American martyrs are on the 19th, and we don't have a morning Mass that day, so I don't get to put their image out. But anyway, so we think of Francis as, again, he's talking to animals like Snow White, or we think of him as some kind of environmentalist. He is actually the patron of ecology, as declared by Pope John Paul II. But I think that we get a lot of sort of mistaken idea about what he was about because of how he has been sort of placed in the culture. And it's not to say that those things are completely wrong. It's just that we have a good beginning that ends up on kind of a different trajectory than where it ought to have gone in terms of both what does the church teach about these realities, but also what did Francis believe about these kinds of things. And so I'm going to go into some aspects of his life that help to illustrate, again, not only why he's important and why he's a beloved saint, but also what it is he has to teach us, why he is a perennial witness to us. So before I get into kind of today we're going to talk about just kind of his biography. We're going to get into the sort of the background information. And then I want to touch on, there are 6 areas that I want to look at in terms of the life of Francis. This is a 3-week series, so we'll, next week, I'll be away on retreat. So we won't have this next week, but then the 2 weeks after that we'll wrap up. And so today we're going to go into the background, the biography, and the 2 points I kind of want to hit are kind of the 2 big ones that we think of when we dig a little bit deeper than just the Francis talk to animals thing. One is talking about Francis as someone who loved creation. Notice I didn't say that he loved the environment. He loved creation. There's a difference. Just like when I was in school for bioethics, they told us that we don't talk about reproduction, we talk about procreation. Reproduction is a scientific term, and it's something that all creatures do, but procreation is something uniquely human. And there's a theological dimension to using that term because it involves cooperating with the will of God. So just the same, there's a difference between talking about creation and talking about the environment. And one of those has a necessarily theological connotation. You can't not do theology when you're talking about creation, because you're talking about something that had to have been made by a creator, and the creator is God. And talking about environment, we can talk about environment, no matter what we believe. That the only presupposition that exists when we talk about environment is that there's stuff around us, because that's literally what the word comes to mean. But in terms of talking about it in an ecological sense, even then, we kind of miss the point. That Francis, instead of being a figure of something of perennial significance to us as people of faith, becomes a pivot point into talking about things that are sometimes divorced from the context of faith. The other thing I want to talk about is the second thing that we're talking about today, after I go through some of the early life of Francis, is actually the notion of poverty. And what did he really mean by that? And what is real poverty and simplicity? Because there are a lot of false ideas about what poverty and simplicity really are. And I say that actually, where I have learned that has been in my experience, short though it is, 4 years as a pastor, that sometimes the way we treat things in the church and think of poverty and simplicity is according to sort of an incomplete idea of what that is. Sort of reaching for the right thing, but kind of going about it in not quite the right way. So we'll talk about what that means and what he has to say about that. And obviously I don't speak for St. Francis, but in terms of looking at the evidence of his life, how does he witness to what poverty really is? Then the next time, so not next week, but the week after, I want to look at Francis as reformer, because reform is another one of those words that, as one of my beloved theology professors in college at the Abbey would say, reform is one of those words about which we have Inigo Montoya problems, and that you keep using that word and I do not think it means what you think it means. That Francis is seen as a reform figure. And there are a lot of saints all throughout the history of the church who are remembered as reform figures. What does it mean to be a reform figure within the church? This is something that I think is in our consciousness because the Second Vatican Council looms large in kind of our view of the recent history of the church. And there's an idea of the Second Vatican Council is undertaken as reform. What does reform really mean? Because within the context of anything else, within the context of, let's say you're a CEO and you want to reform your corporate culture, there are standards by which you have to do that, at least if you want your company to continue to survive and to be profitable. But those values are going to look a little bit different than what do we do when we reform the church? Because what makes a company profitable is not beholden to divine revelation necessarily. But divine revelation can't be reformed. So how does someone who wants to be a loyal son to the church, as Francis did, also exist as a reformed figure? So we'll talk about that. We will look at Francis as evangelist, because sometimes the legacy of St. Francis gets used as a model for a kind of tolerance of other faiths that turns into indifferentism. So it is certainly well and good, and this actually is something that comes from the Second Vatican Council. I'm paraphrasing here, but we do respect the faithful of other religions. We do acknowledge that there are degrees of truthful things within other religions. But we also have to be very clear about the fact that the church is the church that Christ founded, and to be loyal to that is to be sort of valued above all else and has to guide that. And Francis didn't go around just affirming everybody in whatever they wanted to do. And we'll talk about his encounter with the Sultan of Egypt, which is one of the lesser known. I didn't actually know about that until I was in college and a new book came out about them. This is about 2008, I think, 2007, 2008. A book came out called St. Francis and the Conversion of the Muslims. And he took his youthful desire to be a soldier and turned that into a different kind of crusade and preached to the Sultan of Egypt. So we'll talk about that. The last session, there are two areas that we'll talk about that I think are either not well understood or passed over entirely. One of them is Francis as penitent. That him living a life of penance is vitally important to who he is. It's if you hear nothing else of Francis, it doesn't need to be the sermons to the animals. It doesn't need to be almost anything else he said or did, but living a life of penance, embracing the cross. And that, I think, if Francis were to come back today and write the biography of Francis, he would want that to be the thing we know about him. When I design coats of arms for priests, for my brother priests, I tell them, give me the list of 7 things that you want people to know about you. And I have a feeling if Francis were to walk in and ask me to design his coat of arms, and I'd say, give me the 7 things you want people to know about you, the piece of paper would have 7 crosses on it. Obviously, I can't speak for Francis, but that was the thing that he prized above all else, was a life that embraced the cross, and he was rewarded for this, even while he was still alive, and we'll talk about that. The Last thing is Francis as friend, and Francis and Claire as a model of spiritual friendship. And as a model of spiritual friendship that exists between two people who are living a chaste and celibate life. And I think that's also vitally important because it says something to us about the nature of Christian love. That there can be love, there can be friendship. Friendship, which is an idea that is sorely lacking in the culture in which we live now. Because there's this idea that all relationships, and the funny thing is that I'm about to paraphrase C.S. Lewis, who wrote what I'm about to say in the 50s. He said that we've reduced all kinds of love down to basically two things. And one of them is that we love people the way we love things. That we say, I love you, and we mean it about like we love our favorite flavor of ice cream. So in that way, it's a very carnal kind of love, but maybe not in the sensual sense, but it's certainly a very, it's a love devoted to the pleasures. When we say I love something or I love someone, we mean it in the same way. What we mean is this gives me pleasure, and that's about it. And he says it either is the sort of benign pleasure that we take in things and in people, or it's or a deeper carnal pleasure in which we've reduced love down to either ice cream or sex, basically, he says, that it's romantic love. And so friendship is one of the antidotes to this kind of thinking. And Lewis actually proposes that there's a deeper way of seeing love. And in his book, The Four Loves, talks about different kinds of love, different words that mean love, different dimensions of love that are important to recover if we really understand what that is. And I think friendship is a good starting point for that. And Francis and his relationship with Claire, who is one of his very earliest followers, and herself credited as a religious foundress alongside him, that they are a model of kind of an appropriate, very loving, very intimate, and very spiritual friendship that exists within that context of two people who have vowed themselves to God. So those will be the 6 areas of the life of Francis that we cover. This is being recorded partly so that Sister Kathy can watch it and have me strung up by a band of angry Franciscans if I get anything wrong. But I did tell her what I was going to be talking about, and she did give me the Sister Kathy imprimatur, so we will be good here. So let's talk about his background and his early life, because this is the thing about which nobody knows. That everybody again knows the Disney princess, very truncated St. Francis that talked to birds. And let me tell you before we get into that where we get that from. So there are about 3 main sources for his life. You have Thomas of Solano is the earliest biographer, was one of the, I think it's Thomas, but one of his brothers in the order was one of the earliest biographers who actually writes the very earliest accounts of his life, was contemporary with him, traveled with him, worked with him, so writes down a few things, a very few things. And this is actually a running theme all throughout history, that you don't have this idea of somebody, I mean, you have to get into about the 18th century before you have somebody who followed somebody around as their personal secretary and wrote down everything that they did, and then after they died published a big fat book of every moment of their lives. That somebody like Francis, again, we have a few sketchy kind of outline details. Somebody like St. Benedict, the earliest biography of him is written a couple of decades after he's dead. Even, you want to talk about the most important figure in the history of the world, Jesus Christ himself, his biography is written about 30 to 40 to 50-ish years after he dies and rises. Actually, the Gospel of John, depending on when you date it, the Gospel of John was written almost 60 years after Jesus ascends into heaven. So, and that's actually a really narrow gap. There are a lot of ancient figures that we have very reliable biographies that weren't put pen to paper until over a century after they died. So the most reliable source for Francis is the one kind of closest to him, and it's kind of also one of the sketchiest and one of the briefest. St. Bonaventure, himself a Franciscan, also writes a fairly extensive life of St. Francis, and that's going to be another one of the more reliable sources. One of the sources that we get a lot of the kind of legendary, the more folklore sort of sounding things from is a book called The Little Flowers that appeared, I think, about 100 years after his death. I'll have to double check. And just to tell you its stature within the Franciscan community, it's the one that's probably in the reach of most people. I think at home I've got about 3 copies of it that I've gotten from different things. I have one that belonged to my grandfather because he had a great devotion to St. Francis. It's a little, back in the 50s, Image Books, which was an imprint of Doubleday. That was their religious wing. And so it was one of those that my grandpa had like dozens of these, and they smelled good because they smelled like old books, all these little old pulp paperbacks of religious topics. So there was, I have a copy of that. I have one like in a nicer binding, like a little kind of leather binding, and I think I have one or two others that people have given me or whatever. But to tell you its kind of stature, it is interesting reading, but also like a lot of medieval hagiography, so biographies of saints. It is it is very heavily embellished. A lot of it is very legendary. It takes either facts and kind of adds a little bit to them, just to dress them up a little bit, or it outright makes up things, as far as we can tell anyway. And that's not to discount completely, because maybe there are other streams of these things that come down later, but the idea being that what got me kind of looking at it was, and what kind of like, I had a realization about this when I was preparing this talk initially, the first time I did this a couple of years ago. I had a lady in my previous parish who's a secular Franciscan, and I was asking her about sources for the life of Francis so I could really get into who he really was. And she said, don't read the little flowers. She said that in her fraternity, she used to be the director of formation, and they were actually told by their superiors not to use that information anymore, because it isn't a good, reliable biography, because so much of it has been kind of embellished, and so much of the authentic Francis has been kind of lost in all this sort of, these flowery kinds of things. So it's neat reading, and if you like medieval literature, it might be worth looking at. But if you want a better biography, there are better biographers of Francis, and later research. I think we have this idea that because on the one hand, usually closest to the source is going to be a bit better, but a broader range of sources is going to be better. So by now, when we have a lot more access to different texts and different traditions and different streams that come down, researchers have looked into all these things, and there are a lot of very good biographies of St. Francis out there. If I get those unpacked this week, I'll compile because I have 6 or 7 of them that I bought when I initially did these talks a couple of years ago. Anyway, but I'll give you some basic biography about him, because again, this is the part that very, very few people are aware of. He was born in Assisi, in the region of Umbria, in 1181. Assisi is in kind of the highlands in the middle of Italy. It's north of Rome. I've been there. When I was a seminarian, we took a trip to Rome, and we spent a week in Rome, during which I had a sinus infection. And I was determined not to be lying in a hotel room for 8 hours a day while my friends were out having fun. So I woke up every morning and ate a huge breakfast and marched, 6-7 miles with them as we went to the different churches and other holy sites in Rome. And then I would eat a big 3-course Italian lunch with 2.5 glasses of wine and a couple of espressos afterward. And if you know Italian wine glasses, 2.5 glasses is roughly a bottle. And then I would walk another 6 miles and see all the things and do all the things, and then eat a big dinner with a couple of glasses of wine, a double espresso, get gelato on the way back to the hotel, and go to bed at 7:45 and wake up again at 5:30 and do it all over again. And I did that for a week. And weirdly enough, in the middle of that trip, on January 1st, 2015, we served Mass for the Pope in St. Peter's Basilica. And I was terrified that this Pope, who is known for having had a severe lung ailment in his youth, and only having about half of one of his lungs, I was terrified that I was going to give the Pope my sinus infection and he was going to die. I did not kill the Pope, thanks be to God. And actually, weirdly, I was not sick that day. I was sick the 3 days leading up to that. I was sick for like 3 or 4 days after that. But that day, I woke up and it was just gone. And I can't tell you how that happened. But anyway, I did that for the better part of the week. And then we went to Assisi, where we were actually going on a 5-day retreat to prepare for our diaconal ordination. And so I got to Assisi, and I noticed the schedule. I was like, Assisi's much smaller, there's less to see, there's less reason for me to be pushing myself so hard. So I slept 14 hours a day for the first 2 days we were there. And when I wasn't in the chapel for a talk or Mass or Lauds or Vespers, I was in bed drinking NyQuil. And at the end of the 3rd day, I woke up. I went back to my room after dinner. We would have Vespers and then an early dinner. And then I went back to bed after dinner for about 2 hours, and I woke up and felt fine. And I walked up we were staying at a convent on the side of the mountain where Assisi is. And Assisi is really in 2 parts. The lower part of it, there's a couple of the old churches associated with St. Francis, and then the upper part is where the basilicas, the massive basilicas of St. Francis and St. Clare are located, at opposite ends of the town. And I walk up into town from there, and two of my classmates are sitting there in a gelateria, drinking Italian beer and eating gelato and smoking cigarettes. And they told me that the owner of the shop was a Croatian lady that lived up the road in the town of Perugia. And when she saw them coming, she'd turn off the crappy Italian pop music and put on the crappy American pop music for them. And they would sit there and eat gelato until about 11 o'clock at night. So I joined them and had some gelato. And then the next day happened to be the Feast of the Epiphany, which is the end of the Christmas holidays in Europe. And there was nobody in town. So I walked up into town after our morning activities and things. We had breakfast, we had logs, then we had a talk with our retreat master, and then we had kind of time off until the evening. And I walked up into town, and I walked into the Basilica of St. Francis, and there was nobody there. And I got to be alone with the bones of St. Francis for about half an hour. So it was interesting too, because I will say that his tomb made less of an impact on me than the other basilica. St. Clare has a museum at the back of the crypt where there are all these items that belong to him and to Clare. One of them is a lace owl that she hand tatted for him, that's laced from the chest down and about 10 feet long. And he wore that while he was serving the Mass. There are his shoes are in there, and his breviary is in there. And that made more of an impact on me, I think, because his tomb is basically a pile of rocks. But then you could tell somebody had used that stuff. Like, you could his presence was more evident in his stuff, I think. So anyway, but both are very interesting places. But he was born in Assisi. His name was actually Giovanni di Pietro Bermadone. He was baptized Giovanni. His mother named him because his father was actually away on business when he was born. His mother we don't really know a lot about his mother, other than that she was a little more supportive of her son's sort of wild endeavors than his father was. She was from France. She was a noble woman from Provence. But other than that, we don't really know anything. His father was a wealthy silk and cloth merchant. And his father was away on business in France. And though he was named Giovanni, when his father got back, he named him Francesco, the name by which we know him. Either because his mother was of French heritage, or because he was a real, Francophile. Like, he gets back from France where he's just made a ton of money, and he likes a lot of French stuff, and so he names his son basically Frank in Italian, because he just really loves France. So let that be a lesson to you, that if your child is born while you're away on business in Saskatoon or something, that you have a duty to express your enthusiasm by an unflattering nickname. He is remembered for poverty, but he started out not at all living poverty, because his dad was rich and his mother was a noblewoman. So they lived extremely comfortably. Again, this is the 12th century, and being a merchant of any kind is a very lucrative enterprise. And so he lived in a very comfortable upbringing. He liked wearing nice clothes. He liked going out with his friends. He liked spending money. He liked all the pleasures that a young adult with a lot of money will spend his money on. One time in a parish that I was in previously, we had our confirmation students write a paper about their patron saint. And these are always hilarious, because sometimes they don't even bother to change the different typefaces that come from the things they blindly Googled and copy-pasted into the document, because they didn't actually write the paper. And one kid wrote about, his was Francis of Assisi, and he wrote about how he chose St. Francis because St. Francis liked nice things and nice clothes and was very rich, and he liked nice things and nice clothes too. And we called him in and were like, son, you completely missed the point. If he had said he chose St. Francis because he likes animals, that would be forgivable and actually encouraged. But he chose St. Francis because he likes nice things. And it's like, yeah, St. Francis didn't choose you, evidently. The thing about that, though, is that he became disillusioned with wealth very early on. And it almost was like, I think we have this idea that conversion is just this miraculous thing that happens like that. And sometimes that happens. And I think we wish it would happen like that, because it's much cleaner when that happens. Particularly when we're dealing with the frustration either of our own struggle with sin or our own struggle with our attachments to things. We really want that to just go away. We want to wake up in the morning and find out that we're no longer, attracted to whatever sin it is that we keep committing. And that's not how it works. works. And it doesn't work that way either with like a religious conversion or a real conversion of morals. Conversion of morals, by the way, is my attempt to sprinkle a little bit of Benedictine language into a talk about St. Francis, the Conversatio Morum. But, I think we think it's going to be this like instantaneous thing that you'll see the light, That's not how it works. I tell people think vocational discernment is like that too. And I wasn't just sort of like in my 9th hour of adoration in the chapel one day, kneeling on bottle caps when I had a mystical ecstasy. It was a little messier than that. I had to date a French-Canadian girl from West Virginia to find that God was calling me to the priesthood. But also a fairly odd and interesting story that is not apropos of anything we're talking about. But I think we think that's how conversion is supposed to work, that it's just this like lightning bolt kind of moment. And it really isn't. It worked that way for St. Paul. But for a lot of great saints, there's a lot of back and forth. And I think that's to give us hope in the fact that we're going to be back and forth too. St. Augustine is most notable for this. There was as he's having his religious awakening, he keeps kind of, as our Baptist friends would say, backsliding. That there's the famous quote of his, "Lord, make me chaste, but not yet." Because he knew that he needed that, but he also didn't want to, give it up, basically. Francis, I think, had a similar relationship with regards to being attached to material things, in that he did have some early signs of kind of being disillusioned with worldly things and with worldly pleasures and material things, but he still didn't completely give it up. There's the story told very early in his adult life. He was working in his father's shop selling cloth, and a beggar came asking for money. So he wrapped up business with who he was dealing with, who he was selling cloth to, and then he immediately took all the money in his purse and went down and gave it all to the beggar. And his father was furious, and this will be a running theme. His father chastised him for this rather intensely. His friends mocked him for wasting his money on this poor, dirty old man. So there's signs of this already, but again, he's a little back and forth. And we see that in the year 1202, so he's about 20 years old at this point. He became a soldier, and this is sort of an easy job to get at this period in history, because the ideas of countries that have like overarching governments kind of isn't a thing for another few centuries. Like Italy is sort of a loose reality, but what it is that Italy is a loosely allied confederation of states that all happen to speak Italian or some flavor of it. And similar to how Germany isn't really a country until about 200 years ago, and even then, you have all these little provinces and factions and medieval baronies that are all just sort of going at it constantly. This is sort of the reality of feudal Europe, is just these turf wars breaking out all the time. And this will actually happen down to the beginning of the modern period. I mean, this goes on through the Renaissance. This is the shape of like the Renaissance papacy and the kind of the surrounding political environs that all these little city-states are just constantly fighting each other. So easy job to get in 1202. He becomes a soldier, and while he's fighting for his own region, he does become imprisoned, and in prison he becomes ill. And this is normally the point in the story where somebody has their "I've seen the light" moment, and they come back and they turn into St. Francis of Assisi and go on and live a happy life that will lead them to heaven. But that's not what happened to him. After a year of being a prisoner of war, he returns to Assisi, and while he had been bedridden and in prison, thinking about his old way of life, he goes right back to it as soon as he's back home among his friends. A few years later, in 1205, he's on another military campaign, and while he's doing this, he has a vision. And nobody really is clear on what the vision was. But he comes back home and he appears to have been smitten somehow. He appears to be almost in love, infatuated with something or someone he's seen while away in combat. And somebody asks him, "Have you met the woman you're going to marry?" And he says, "Yes, and her name is Lady Poverty." So whatever had been kind of knocking on his heart at that point, previously, as he's kind of had his legs taken out from under him in battle. And again, this is also going to be a running theme. St. Ignatius of Loyola has roughly the same story, in that he's a wealthy nobleman, he has a castle, he gets shot in the leg with a cannonball during a siege. He became then the only saint in history to be canonized twice. He's lying around reading novels, and that makes him really bored and really restless, and he knows that he'll read the novels and he'll be excited about knights and about rescuing damsels and things like that while he's reading, but then when he quits reading, he just feels empty. Kind of the way we do now when we sit and we watch YouTube for 6 or 7 hours on end, and then you put your phone down and you're like, oh, now what? You know? Or you're in the middle of that, and you realize you've run out of internet. You've watched the same 19 things already 1,000 times. You're going to go back and watch them again for no real reason, but you could be doing almost anything but that. But that's just sort of where we're at. We're all living in this big sort of Ignatian retreat, except we're not going to the other side of it, which is to read the books about Jesus and to find that the peace that gives you sticks with you. So again, this is a recurring theme throughout history where high-born, comfortable, or even sort of sensual men become prisoners of war or get injured in battle and then become religious founders. So, and that's one of the things I love about talking about the lives of the saints, is just in general, is that for all of, if you've met a saint, you've met a saint. So all of them have a different story, but also the script is the same for all of them. And I think that goes back to something that all stories are fundamentally the same. Everybody's trying to get home. And saints are people who've made it home. And while the routes they're taking to get there look a little bit different in the details, they all, broadly speaking, have the same story. That he had a life where he had these sort of factors presented to him. He embraced Christ in those sort of details of his life, and he became the saint. I always say that, like, I don't have to make up a new homily or look up a biography anytime a saint who was a royal or a noble comes up, because they all have the same story, with the exception of St. Wenceslaus, who was martyred. All of the other royal saints, their story was literally, they grew up in the royal household, they lived a very holy life in spite of the fact that they had their high station and their great power and their wealth and their comfort. They used their office to feed the poor and advance the church and care for the sick. And many of them, especially the women, after their husbands died, they took their estate and sold it all and gave it to the poor and usually became nuns. And it's like all of them have the same story. I've just told you the story of about 27 different saints. At least 9 of whom are in the general calendar. So anyway, so after this, his life really changes. He sees this vision where he meets Lady Poverty, who he wants to marry. And like I said, we'll talk about who Lady Poverty really is. He makes a pilgrimage to Rome. He joins the poor in begging outside of St. Peter's Basilica. Bear in mind that at this point in history, this is not the St. Peter's Basilica that you have seen on television or that you have probably been to if you've been to it, because that wasn't built until the 16th century. This is the old St. Peter's Basilica that was built in the 4th century, and it would get taken down and put back up and things like that. So I love how people think that St. Peter's isn't really built over the bones of St. Peter's, and then when Paul VI had excavations done under the altar, they found some bones there in a place that was known to be a graveyard for early Christians, and they DNA analyzed the bones and found that they were the bones of a 1st century Palestinian man who was approximately 60 years old. And it's like, well, if that's not St. Peter, then who is it? So he goes to Rome, he makes this pilgrimage, and then he comes back to his region, but he spends a lot of time just in solitude, living in caves and reflecting on things, living in churches. He goes into the church of San Damiano, which is known to most people because of the cross of San Damiano, the icon cross. It's a Byzantine icon that somehow ends up in Italy through accidents of history, where there was this period where southern Italy was Byzantine, and some of it still is actually. There is one of the Eastern Catholic churches that nobody's ever heard of is the Italo-Albanian Catholic Church, and it only exists at the very southern tip of Italy, where there's one monastery that is like the entirety of the Italo-Albanian Catholic Church, but it's the last vestige of when the Byzantine Empire ruled half of Italy. But you have this icon that ends up there due to that kind of time in history, and it's this icon of the cross, and again, very familiar to us. It's this very colorful image. It's the processional cross here at this parish, because this parish was formerly run by Franciscans. The facade of the church actually has an outline of it. Our bishop, being himself a Franciscan, placed that as the Episcopal cross on his coat of arms, though technically in heraldry you can't specify the shape of your Episcopal cross, so if I drew his coat of arms, I could do it differently if I wanted. But it's that Byzantine icon cross, sort of rimmed in reddish orange, and it's got figures standing under the cross, and if I had thought about it, I would have brought one with me because they're everywhere around here. But Jesus speaks to him from that cross. And he's in this ruined chapel of San Damiano, and Jesus speaks to him and says, "Go and repair my church." And Francis takes this literally and thinks he means to fix up this building he's in. So he goes back to his father's business, and he sells some cloth, and he takes the proceeds and tries to give them to the priest of San Damiano to fix the church. And the priest won't accept this ill-gotten gain. And then Francis is so frustrated that he won't accept his charity that he throws the money on the floor in the church. Needless to say, his dad was not going to be terribly happy about this, so he went and hid in a cave nearby for about a month. And when he got home, his father, of course, drags him home and beats him and locks him up in a storeroom for a little while. His dad goes away again on business, his mom lets him out, and he goes back to San Damiano, and again attempts to fix up the church and ends up succeeding at this. But he does so using his dad's money, and again his dad is not happy about this, and even tries to pursue legal action. So he takes him to court. And in those days, who did you go to court before? But the local bishop. So they go before the bishop of Assisi, and his father is basically trying to not only get back the money that he took, but more or less to levy his inheritance. That Francis, being the oldest son, had a right to an inheritance, and so his father is basically suing him to revoke that, so that when he dies he can't have anything, that he's basically levying the inheritance to pay back the things that are lost. At this moment, Francis has sort of the like pivotal point in his story, sort of the climactic point, in that he renounces his claim to anything material. He renounces his inheritance, whether he has to be told to legally or not. And the story goes that at that point he even strips off his clothes to show that he's renounced the worldly things. He strips off these fine clothes. He's standing there before the bishop naked. And the bishop then, it said, covers him with his own cloak. There's another version of that whereby Francis embraced poverty so utterly that he tried to go around without clothes on, and the bishop ordered him that he couldn't do that, but I'm not sure if that, I think that might be one of those medieval embellishments. I'll ask Sister Kathy. But he begins wandering around, begging for food and for money, and restoring chapels, wearing very simple clothing. There's leper colonies nearby, and he goes and he nurses the lepers to health. In 1208, he's in church one day, and he hears the gospel of the commissioning of the 12. And this is going to be the moment where he decides that he's going to form an order. He starts wearing a coarse woolen tunic that we might be familiar with, not only from popular imagery of Francis, where he's wearing a coarse woolen tunic, but also because the orders that followed his rule and his way of life to this day still do, in some form or another. Some of them have switched to polyester, but you do still see Franciscans wearing wool habits in imitation of their founder. We associate him a lot, and this is true of all religious orders, that all of them kind of have their school colors, so to speak. The Benedictines, they wear black, and in tropical climates they'll wear a white tunic, but they'll put a black scapular over it to show that they're Benedictine. The Dominicans wear white. The Jesuits wear Hawaiian shirts. The Franciscans wear brown. The Carmelites wear brown. But actually, first off, in the Franciscans, it depends on which order of Franciscans they are, because some of them wear different colors. And for most religious orders, their founder didn't really specify anything other than wear something really plain. So it's like for Benedict, it was the habit should kind of look like what the ordinary working man is wearing in the town in which you're in. So wear whatever robe everybody else, like anybody that's any minimum wage worker in your town that would be out like nailing shingles on the roof, this is how you should dress. And so that's how, but over time it got stylized into something, because religious habits come to be kind of a uniform that sort of signifies the way of life that the person wearing it has. And so the same is true of Francis. That's why there are, if you were to go look up Franciscan habit, the most common image that's going to come to mind is shaped sort of like this one on this statue, but it's going to be brown. The conventual Franciscans who were here, and our bishop is a member of the conventual Franciscans, they wear gray, kind of a scratchy gray cloth. You will see them in various colors, various shades of gray or brown and things like that, and different cuts and styles too, depending on kind of which tradition, which sort of stream they're coming out of. But I don't want to attempt to go into all the different kinds of Franciscans, because there is that old joke about one of the things not even known to God, and one of them is how many orders of Franciscans there are. He wandered around preaching about penance, brotherly love, and peace. The knotted rope becomes a part of the habit. We see that on the statue here. And they wear the knotted rope as a sign of their commitment to chastity, and that begins with him. He didn't have a license to preach. So one of the things you'll see on this I like this image because it shows that he's got a shoulder cape on. In ecclesiastical context, going back to this period even, a shoulder cape was a symbol of jurisdiction.
So religious orders that have a shoulder cape as a symbol, as part of their habit, they were ones that were authorized to preach. The Dominicans, because they are the order of preachers, they dress in the habit of someone who is authorized to preach, because preaching is something that actually requires authority to do. So as a priest incarnated in the diocese, I automatically have a faculty to preach, just in fact of being a part of the diocese. The bishop could, if I weren't a pastor, and as a pastor, because of my office, I have a right to preach. And pretty much anywhere that I haven't been told I can't. And I have an absolute right in my own parish as long as I'm the pastor. For a priest who isn't a pastor, who doesn't carry an office that has that, the bishop could theoretically revoke his right to preach. So you have presumed permission until, let's say you get up and you start talking about how Jesus was not the Son of God and he was actually a chainsaw juggling rodeo clown, and then you get a call from the bishop saying, okay, well for 6 months you weren't allowed to preach, or I will suspend you from the priesthood. So that you have to have that authorization, because to teach is an exercise of the authority of the church that is vested uniquely in the bishop. That's why the symbols of his office are a hat with 2 points for the Old and New Testament, and a shepherd's crook, which is the kind of the staff of a teacher. That his job is to teach, and his job is to empower others to do so who can have that authority. But at the time, Francis wouldn't have been wearing a shoulder cape because he didn't actually have jurisdiction, he didn't have license to preach, he wasn't even a cleric. He attracted some followers within a year. He had about 11 men following him. They lived in a former leper colony, and they traveled around the region of Umbria preaching. In 1209, he composed a simple rule. If you read religious rules, some of them have different kind of things going on, depending on what was sort of their origin, why were they written, where did the ideas of them come from. For Saint Benedict, this is the one I'm the most intimately familiar with because I read it every day. For Benedict, he was taking earlier monastic rules and kind of distilling them into a practice that was a little bit more accessible and adaptable to different circumstances. Because some of the early rules are very strict. They're coming out of the tradition of the Desert Fathers. So there was the anonymously authored rule of the Master. There was the writing of St. John Cassian, who's one of the Desert Fathers. There's the rule of St. Basil. And all of these kind of form the basis. At times, Benedict is quoting these rules verbatim. And at times, he alludes to what they say, like by name. He says, in the rule of the Master, we read this. So sometimes, for Benedict, that's what it is. It's the handbook on how to be a monk and how to have a monastery. And that's why it's very interesting that the Benedictine tradition doesn't contain a whole ton of other things kind of telling you how to do it. That later the ritual will develop where you've got, we need to have ceremonies in the monastery to elect an abbot, to take vows, things like that. But for the most part, you have the rule, and that's, you're kind of set. You've got the rule, you've got the Bible, and you've got your divine office, and you're good. For Francis, his rule was a list of Bible verses. And the rule basically boiled down to follow the teachings of our Lord Jesus Christ and to walk in his footsteps. And that was pretty much it. So after this kind of grows, and they feel like this has got the wheels to be something for the good of the church, he travels to Rome for an audience with Pope Innocent III. Innocent III is a very interesting figure. He is not a saint. If I'm remembering right, I don't think he was ever canonized, but he is incredibly influential. That if Gregory the Great in the 6th century is kind of the beginning of the medieval papacy, Innocent III is sort of the apex of it. That he is incredibly influential, and one of the things he did was to encourage the founding of certain religious orders, and this is one of them. So they come to have an audience with him, and he won't receive them in formal audience because there's just about a dozen of them. And he says basically you can come have a formal audience and we'll talk about approving an order after you've grown in numbers and we see the good fruits of what you're doing. But at the time, he orders that they are to be tonsured. So formerly it was that you were admitted to the clerical state by tonsure. So now you are admitted to the clerical state when you're ordained to the diaconate. So there are no minor clergy anymore. But there used to be a system of minor clergy that generally was you went through these offices on your way into the priesthood. But before you could receive any of them, you had to be tonsured. And tonsure is literally to clip the hair. So there would be, in seminaries, there'd be a ceremony for the men entering major seminary where they come up and the bishop would bless their cassock, because the cassock is the garb of a cleric, whether he's a minor cleric or in major orders. and then would clip off a little bit of his hair. The idea was the hair was kind of an offering that he could give. In religious orders, they would shave off all but a ring of hair, and it was again a sign of submission, and this is why Francis is depicted with this sort of weird haircut. I'm not certain that he actually ever wore that himself. This is something that gets a little bit stylized in iconography of him. But I do know that the earliest known image of him, and I have to put in a plug for this because of where it's at, the earliest known image of him is actually a fresco on the walls of the church of Subiaco. Subiaco is a Benedictine abbey. Subiaco is not only a Benedictine abbey, it's one of the like four most important monasteries in the whole kind of Benedictine world. Because it is the abbey where, so if you have Norcia, which is where Benedict was born, you have Monte Cassino, which was bombed into the Stone Age by the Allies during World War II because they thought the Germans were using it as a spy post, and that probably was not true. And then they now have a very beautiful, very nice brand new monastery that guilty American donors raised millions of dollars to build for them, but that's where Benedict and Scholastica are buried. St. Paul outside the walls is very important because it's attached to one of the four papal basilicas. And there's a couple others that are fairly important, but Subiaco is one of the three kind of like big ones because it was the place where, when Benedict was living as a hermit, his cave was there. And then they built a church over the cave. And so now it's this abbey, and it's still a fairly decent sized abbey. It's got about 63 monks, which for an abbey in Europe these days is actually huge. I mean, that's, even for the United States, that would be a very large abbey. Most abbeys in this country have 2 to 3 dozen monks. St. Vincent's in Latrobe is the largest monastery in the world, and they've got like 150 or 180 monks, if I'm remembering right. I have a friend who went to seminary there. But anyway, so Subiaco has a fresco that is the earliest known image of Francis, and it was actually painted while he was still alive. But it wasn't painted, it was painted while he was still alive, kind of near the end of his life, but it also doesn't depict him with stigmata, which is something that happens towards the end of his life. So it would have been early enough that he didn't have the stigmata yet, or wasn't known to have had them. But Francis actually visited there, which is why they have a fresco of him. He visited, and by that point was kind of known for having founded this order, and he visited so that he could take a retreat with the monks there and in St. Benedict's cave. And then when he did that, they kind of commemorated his visit by painting him on the wall. And you can still to this day go and see the oldest image of St. Francis is in a Benedictine abbey, much to the chagrin, I'm sure, of the Franciscans. But he wasn't depicted as wearing a tonsure. He just sort of had a normal haircut, at least not a full tonsure like that. The reason that Francis and his brothers were admitted as minor clergy was to show their submission to the authority of the church. There had been other groups popping up in Europe at around this time that were not obedient to the teachings of the church, and this was a way for them to show some goodwill, to submit to authority, and also for the authorities to say, you're now bound to all these, you're bound by oath to uphold the teachings of the church. The Pope's advisors did not want him to approve this new order. They thought it was a little bit too much of we might call it a wildcat venture, in that all the other orders that are kind of hanging around now live in monasteries. They live fairly stable lives. They live lives of prayer and of penance. And to have them out and about like this might not be a great idea. That having them wander around, they could easily kind of lapse into sensuality. They could fall in with the wrong company. They might not be the best foot forward for the church. You read the beginning of the Rule of St. Benedict, and after the prologue, where he kind of lays out why he wrote the rule, he then talks about the kinds of monks. And two of the kinds of monks he's describing is probably what Pope Innocent had in mind when he's thinking about this order that's going to travel around and not have anything and have to beg for food, because Benedict talks about the girovagi, and a girovagus literally means to wander around. Like a vagrant is somebody who wanders, and gyros is Greek for a circle, so someone who wanders around. And the girovagi basically wander monastery to monastery and eat them out of house and home and then leave. And then the Cerabates do that but worse, and Benedict says that of their detestable way of life, it is better to be silent than to speak. And then he says the two good kinds of monks are hermits, which you can only be a hermit after you've been a cenobite, which is a monk. You've lived in a monastery. But then he says, but let's focus on monks because that's why I'm writing this rule. But anyway, this talk is turning into a talk on St. Benedict, and I'm loving it. But, so Innocent was actually, Pope Innocent was reticent about allowing this order to be founded. And he was kind of siding with his advisors. He was about to call them back and say, yeah, you know, nice work you're doing over there in Umbria, but we really can't, like, franchise this thing out. And then he had a dream one night, and there's actually I think Giotto's the one who paints this. There's the dream of Innocent, of Francis holding up the Lateran Basilica. And the Lateran Basilica is one of the 4 papal archbasilicas, St. Peter, St. Paul outside the walls, St. Mary Major, and the Archbasilica of St. John Lateran. And it is the Pope's cathedral. We think of St. Peter's, but it's not his cathedral. His actual chair as the Bishop of Rome is in John Lateran. It's my favorite of the 4 because the interior is quite beautiful, and Pope Leo XIII is buried there, and he's the greatest pope of modern times, and my favorite pope. So Innocent has this vision of Francis holding up the Lateran Basilica, and this is on the 16th of April in the year 1210, which is marked as the official founding of the order because it was after this that Francis is given approval to start an order according to this rule. Innocent did require him to write an actual rule, though. It couldn't just be a page of Bible verses. That he had to actually spell out statutes for his congregation. And to this day, that is actually somewhat the procedure, that if you wanted to found a religious community, and you got about a dozen followers, there's a series of approvals you have to go through, first at the diocesan level, and you have to show that you have statutes and that you're sort of operating a certain way. And then if the bishop approves it, if you wanted to become, say, a religious order that branched out into the neighboring diocese and to the other dioceses around, then there would be another level that the Vatican would have to get involved in, more or less declare you a religious order. So, the last little detail of kind of this phase of his life, and we're leaving off before we get to kind of the meat of him being St. Francis, because that's going to come as we talk about these other aspects of who he is. He was ordained a deacon later on, so he's already a cleric at this point, but he's like a minor cleric, and is not in holy orders. He will be ordained a deacon, but not a priest. He didn't feel he was worthy to consecrate the Eucharist. And so he became a deacon, which then enabled him to minister in other ways, but he couldn't offer the Mass. So I'm running up on time here, but I will allude to a couple of things and then maybe get into those in more detail next time. I can actually, instead of going 2, 2, and 2, I can divide the next 2 talks into 3 points and 3 points so that I can fill my runtime. But to touch briefly on Francis as kind of a figure for creation or environment. We see him again, one of the popular perceptions is that he's this environmentalist, type. And the problem with that, again, is, as I said, creation is laden with theological meaning. Creation implies a creator, and who is the creator? The God, who we profess in the Creed to be the creator of heaven and earth. And so the idea is that, like I say, I think what happens is that Francis is held up as sort of the pivot into talking about the environment, talking about ecology, while then divorcing it from a religious context. That we use him as sort of a springboard. But what do you do when you jump off the high dive? You leave the high dive behind. And that's not really what he is. For Francis, he recognizes in creation the presence of God. And we can't think of him as a pantheist. Pantheism is the idea that God is literally in everything, and everything is to be worshipped as God. And that's not, first off, not Catholic, and second off, not what Francis believed. The Francis believed what the church taught. And the idea is that because God created everything, we can see his fingerprints in creation. Just like you can analyze the brush strokes in a painting to see something of the painter. That you could tell who painted something based on how they paint. That's actually how they identify art forgeries, is the brush strokes are pointed in the wrong direction, basically. That this person was left-handed and the forger was right-handed, or things like that. At least I imagine that's how that works. I've never identified or forged a painting. So he's going along with this whole thing of, or Francis's kind of whole teaching in this regard, is that creation is something to be loved and to be embraced because it shows forth the presence of God, but it is not itself divine. It's something apart from God. Because if creation is a part of God, then God isn't God. And so So he sees, again, he regards it not as environment, but as creation, and not simply as an end to itself, but as something that signifies, something that points beyond itself to the one who created it. He has a very incarnational spirituality, and because God became man, enters into human history. God touches our experience in a very deep way, and this includes in our engagement with creation and our ability to see him present there. There's a story that goes around that he didn't eat meat because he couldn't bear to kill animals, and that's actually not true. There are actually accounts of Francis eating meat. In fact, one of my favorite quotes, and he really did say this is not medieval folklore, and we'll talk about this when we talk about him as a penitent and what penance really is, and this actually ties in a little bit to poverty and simplicity as well, but very devoted to penance. I mean, he lived the life of a penitent even before he was in a religious order. Like, that was what he was doing in the days where he's sort of forming his overall kind of approach to these things. Living the life of a penitent, and one of the brothers asks him at one point, if Christmas falls on a Friday, and in those days Friday abstinence was mandatory all year round, if Christmas falls on a Friday, should we abstain from meat? And he said, you sin in asking the question. Not only should you not abstain from meat, but the walls should be smeared with meat, so that they may share in the feasting. And to this day, in canon law, canon 1215 says that any time Friday abstinence would normally bind, but a solemnity falls on a Friday, you could eat meat. So a couple years ago, it was really awesome, the Feast of the Incarnation, which is literally the enmeatment of Jesus, because to incarnate is to put something in flesh, and flesh and meat are the same thing. Like in German, meat is just fleisch. So the literal enmeatment of Jesus fell on a Friday during Lent. So I declared Meat Friday and had my staff over, and I cooked a pork roast and some sausages and some bacon that a friend of mine had smoked in his smokehouse, and some prosciutto mozzarella pinwheels, and yeah, so we had Meat Friday. And that's again in that spirit. The idea is that, as Ecclesiastes says, there's a time to mourn and a time to dance. There's a time where it's appropriate to do penance, and then there's a time where it's not. Several years ago, I was at a parish where our patronal feast day fell on a Friday one time, and somebody asked, well, we're going to have a potluck. It's like, could we encourage people to bring a meatless option for those of us who are going to abstain from meat on Friday? And the pastor said no, because it is inappropriate to abstain from meat on a solemnity. This is our parish patronal feast day. We should go crazy, And Francis believed that too, because I think we might look at that, if we were to do a bit of historic forensic psychology and say, where did he get that from? Well, he lived a dissolute life of pleasure as a young man. I don't think it was that he left all that behind. He didn't reject pleasure. He put it in its proper context once he was living a life of faith and a life of upright morals. That he saw these things as good because they came from God. And that goes back to that classic point from the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis, where he says that Screwtape, the demon who's writing to his nephew, says that pleasure is not from our Father here below, talking about the devil. He says pleasure comes from the enemy, comes from God. And in spite of all of our efforts, we cannot make even one pleasure in hell. That our scientists have been trying for centuries, and we cannot produce pleasure because pleasure is a good. And the problem with tempting someone by a pleasure is that may lead them to God. So I can't help but think that his over-attachment to the pleasures as a young man may have led him to properly appreciate them later. And that's why he could say on Christmas, smear the walls with meat. I did have to warn my parishioners when I informed them of Canon 1215 that allows for the eating of meat on a Lenten Friday that a solemnity covers up, that they were not allowed, as much as I enjoy that sentiment, they were not allowed to smear meat on the walls of the church because the cleaning bills would be insane and we couldn't afford that. But this parish has a little bit more money, so maybe we could smear the walls with meat. But only if Christmas is on a Friday. Let me tell you, Christmas falling on a Friday, Christmas Day falling on a Friday is not terrible. Christmas Day falling on a Monday is a nightmare. And particularly when you are in a small parish with a mission a half hour away and you're the only priest there. In which case you have to celebrate 9 masses in 48 hours. Starting on Saturday afternoon, and then you have to do 3 a day for 3 days in a row. And then the next mass is your funeral, and you don't get to celebrate that. So it isn't true that Francis didn't eat meat. We know he ate meat, and we know that he encouraged the eating of meat on feast days. And again, I think this would have fallen in less with, this would have fallen in with an idea that looks at creation as something to be good stewards of, but not to elevate to almost a divine level. Poverty is the other kind of big thing that we remember him for, and I've already alluded to that a little bit when he talks about Lady Poverty. There's this idea that poverty means just living with the barest of essentials, if even that. There's this idea that poverty, that there's this inherent nobility to not having stuff, or to wearing threadbare clothing, or to not cleaning things up, or to not fixing things, to living in squalor. And there is an inherent nobility to living in squalor, because you can find the average crack house, and there are people living there in squalor, and we would not be canonizing most of them anytime soon. I pray for the day that we can canonize them because they've converted. But there isn't an inherent nobility to not having stuff. Because poverty is really, for Francis, not a rejection of the material, but again, a right appropriation of it. Not letting your possessions possess you is the best way to put it. That's how, when it comes up in like Lenten reflections and things like that, that's how we talk about that. So poverty is not this thing that is, again, just sort of inherently noble, because there are morally upright people who have a lot of money and who have a lot of stuff, but also don't let it dominate their lives. And if you want to know who those people are, they're the people who donate a lot of money to the church and also don't have their name on anything for doing it. The story is told of Mother Angelica of the Poor Clares in Hanceville, Alabama, a Franciscan herself, who had this policy at the shrine of the Most Blessed Sacrament there that no matter who donated what or how much they donated, no memorial plaques would go on anything. Because she said, we are not building this for the glory of anybody but God. And so built this massive church that's marble, Spanish Gothic architecture, gold high altar, solid silver gold-plated 8-foot-tall monstrance in the church where adoration happens day and night. Beautiful Spanish architecture with kind of tile roof, huge monastery complex behind a 12-foot high wall, big plaza where they can have kind of big outdoor processions and things like that. There's the outdoor stations of the cross right there. There's a little chapel to the Nativity. There's the castle where the administrative offices for the lay staff are, and the bookstore there. Great bookstore there, by the way. None of it has a single donation plaque anywhere. And I heard a story years ago. I was staying there when I was in college on a retreat, and one of the brothers that they used to have another religious order there that kind of did the outside work for them. And one of the brothers was talking to us about Mother Angelica, and he said that she had this very strict policy with this. And they had a donor come in one day, and fairly devout man, a very wealthy man. And he asked her, he said, I just have this special request. He said, I know you don't want to put anybody's name on anything, but could we please, just somewhere for me and my family, somewhere only we're going to know about it, just so that, my family, and she said, absolutely not. And this man almost walked out of her room with a check for $4 million because she refused to, and eventually they were able to talk him into not walking out with his money, but also his name and his family's name didn't go on anything. Because again, for her, it was not about that attachment to things. It was about glorifying God. And so if you embrace a life of poverty so that you can point to how humble and simple you are, you've already failed. I have a priest friend who, when he was just starting out, he was a young priest, and he was at a funeral at some parish, and the pastor walks in, and he's wearing a very plain polyester chasuble. It's just a plain, it looks like a white tablecloth with a hole in it. And he says to my friend, he says, yeah, you see here, he says, this is what you wear if you want to be humble and simple. And my friend said, Father, let me ask you. He said, that BMW 5 Series outside, is that yours? He said, yeah. He said, then don't talk to me about poverty. Francis actually famously said, this is another thing he actually said, that poverty ends at the altar rail. That we live simply. We live this, this way where we trust in the providence of God to provide for our needs, but we give God our best once we're in church. And again, that's why when you go to the Basilica of St. Clare, there's this 10-foot long lace out that he wore, because he knew that he needed to give God his very best when he went into the sanctuary. And so that's really, the spirit of poverty is again not one of rejecting good things, rejecting pleasure, and certainly not rejecting beauty, particularly in our worship of God. It's one that again rightly regards these things, and sees things as a means to an end, sees the things of creation as a means to an end, and not an end unto themselves. Not to let our possessions possess us, or I would argue not to let a false sense of simplicity possess us, because it can kind of go both ways. That when we talk about a virtue, the virtue of simplicity, let's say, is going to have two opposing vices. There's going to be one where you have too much stuff, you're too materialistic. There's also going to be one where you reject good things and reject their goodness in and of themselves. And I think that's kind of the line we walk. I've lived in a number of rectories and worked in a number of church properties where previous pastors said they were trying to live simply, and so they just didn't repair things. And that's not simplicity, that's bad stewardship. You wouldn't treat your own house like that, so you definitely shouldn't treat God's house like that. That it's not simplicity to let things run into the ground. And Francis, I think, we know because of his track record of rebuilding chapels that he would probably not approve of, just duct taping the plumbing together just to kind of hold it. That we would give God our best. And I would say we give God our best in every way, including in how we do the plumbing. So next week I won't be here because, as I say, I'll be on retreat. The actual priest retreat was canceled by virtue of the fact that it's in Maggie Valley, which is currently Maggie River, or possibly Lake. But Father Paul and I are still taking the week to have a little time away, a little bit of time to, in my case, to unpack, because I haven't done that yet, and just otherwise like kind of rest up a little bit because we've been here for 3 months now and need a minute. But then I'll be back the week after that with the next installment of this, where we will talk about Francis as reformer and Francis as evangelist, and maybe if I think of some other points that maybe I missed with the others, we'll talk about that then. So thank you very much. I'm gonna go have a cup of coffee and get ready for my next talk in an hour-ish.